On a Tuesday afternoon in October 2007, 16-year-old Maya Chen walked out of Lincoln High School in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and disappeared into the golden light of autumn. She had been arguing with her best friend about something trivial, whether to go to homecoming together or separately, the kind of disagreement that feels monumental at 16 but dissolves with time. Maya's backpack, heavy with textbooks and dreams of journalism school, bounced against her shoulder as she pushed through the heavy glass doors one final time. If you've ever felt the weight of words left unsaid, of chances that slipped away in the ordinary moments we thought would last forever, then you understand why Maya's story still echoes today. Some mysteries aren't just about what happened. They're about what we failed to see while it was happening right in front of us. The school parking lot buzzed with the familiar chaos of dismissal. Yellow buses lined up like sleeping giants, their engines rumbling with patient authority. Cars idled as parents waited, some scrolling phones, others watching the stream of teenagers emerge from the brick building that had stood since 1963. Maya's mother, Susan Chen, sat in her silver Honda Civic in the designated pickup zone, NPR playing softly through the speakers, her eyes scanning the crowd for her daughter's familiar purple jacket. Maya had gotten her driver's license 6 months earlier, but Susan still insisted on picking her up on Tuesdays after her SAT prep class. It was their time, 30 minutes in the car, where Maya would decompress from her day, sharing fragments of teenage drama that Susan treasured even when she pretended to find them exhausting. Maya was meticulous about these arrangements, the kind of teenager who still kissed her mother goodbye and never forgot to text when plans changed. But on this particular Tuesday, Maya never appeared. Susan waited 15 minutes past their agreed time, watching the parking lot empty as buses pulled away and cars departed one by one. She tried calling Maya's flip phone, hearing it ring endlessly before going to voicemail. The sound of her daughter's recorded voice, bright, slightly rushed, apologetic, would replay in Susan's mind for years to come. At 3:47 p.m., Susan parked her car and walked into the school. The hallways echoed with the hollow quiet that follows the exodus of students, punctuated only by the distant sound of janitors beginning their evening routine. She found Maya's SAT prep teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, packing up her materials in room 204. "Maya never showed up today," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her brow furrowing with genuine concern. "I thought maybe she was sick." The words hit Susan like cold water. Maya had left the house that morning with her usual Tuesday routine: oatmeal with brown sugar, a quick review of her vocabulary flashcards, a complaint about the pop quiz and AP history. She had been looking forward to SAT prep because Mrs. Rodriguez had promised to review the essay portion, and Maya dreamed of attending Northwestern's journalism program. Susan spent the next hour retracing her daughter's steps. Maya's locker stood closed, combination undisturbed. Her regular teachers confirmed she had attended all her morning classes. Her best friend Jessica remembered their argument by the lockers during lunch, but insisted Maya seemed fine afterward, maybe a little quiet, but not upset enough to skip class or disappear. The last confirmed sighting came from Tommy Valdez, a junior who worked in the school office during 7th period. He remembered seeing Maya walk toward the main entrance around 3:15 p.m., her purple jacket bright against the afternoon light streaming through the glass doors. She was alone, walking at her usual pace, nothing about her demeanor suggesting distress or urgency. And then, nothing. By 6 p.m., Susan had called Maya's father, David, who left work immediately and drove the familiar routes between school and home, checking the library, the coffee shop where Maya sometimes studied, and the small park where she liked to read when the weather was nice. By 8 p.m., they had contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department. Detective Ray Morrison, a 15-year veteran who had seen his share of missing teenager cases, took their report with professional thoroughness. "Most kids who disappeared came home within 24 hours, he explained gently. They ran off with friends, got caught up in teenage drama, or simply lost track of time." But as he looked at Maya's school photo, her earnest dark eyes, her slight smile, the careful way she had positioned her hands in her lap, something told him this case would be different. Maya Chen was not the kind of teenager who disappeared without explanation. She was vice president of the debate team, maintained a 4.2 GPA, and had never missed a curfew. Her college applications were already submitted early to 3 universities. Her bedroom was organized, her calendar meticulously maintained, her relationship stable and supportive. The initial investigation moved quickly. Maya's phone records showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to her disappearance. Her social media accounts, a MySpace page she rarely updated, and an email account used primarily for school, revealed nothing concerning. Friends and teachers described her as happy, focused, maybe a little stressed about college applications, but nothing beyond normal teenage anxiety. Security cameras from the school's front entrance confirmed Tommy Valdez's account. At 3 hours 14 minutes and 33 seconds p.m., Maya could be seen walking toward the doors, her backpack over one shoulder, her purple jacket zipped against the October chill. At 3 hours 14 minutes and 47 seconds p.m., she pushed through the glass doors and stepped outside, and then the cameras lost her. The investigation expanded. Volunteers searched the wooded area behind the school, the creek that ran along Maple Street, and the abandoned railroad tracks that students sometimes used as a shortcut downtown. Maya's photo appeared on local news broadcasts and was posted on telephone poles throughout Cedar Falls. Tips trickled in. Someone thought they saw her at the mall. Another claimed she was hitchhiking on Highway 218, but none led anywhere substantial. As October turned to November, the case began to follow the familiar pattern of missing person investigations. Media attention faded. Tips became less frequent. The active search transitioned into a waiting game, with Maya's family clinging to hope while the community slowly, reluctantly, began to move on. But Susan Chen never stopped waiting. Every Tuesday at 3:30 p.m., she would park in the same spot in the Lincoln High School parking lot, watching the doors her daughter had walked through for the last time. The silver Honda Civic became a fixture, a reminder to anyone who noticed that some absences never heal, some mysteries never rest. The first months after Maya's disappearance moved with the strange elasticity of time that accompanies trauma, days that stretched endlessly, and weeks that disappeared without notice. Susan Chen found herself navigating a world that looked identical to the one her daughter had inhabited, but felt fundamentally altered, as if someone had shifted all the furniture just slightly to the left. Maya's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it that Tuesday morning. Her debate team notes scattered across the desk, marked with her neat handwriting and color-coded highlighters. A half-finished college essay about the importance of local journalism still glowed on her laptop screen, the cursor blinking patiently after the incomplete sentence. I believe that telling the stories of ordinary people reveals the extraordinary truth about our communities. Because what? Susan would find herself staring at that unfinished thought, wondering what insight her daughter had been reaching for, what truth she had been about to articulate. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat, marking time in a room where time had stopped. David Chen handled his grief differently, throwing himself into action with the desperate energy of a man who believed the right combination of effort and determination could solve any problem. He printed thousands of flyers and drove to surrounding towns, tacking Maya's photo to bulletin boards in gas stations and grocery stores. He maintained a detailed spreadsheet of tips and leads, cross-referencing information with the methodical precision of the accountant he had been before his daughter's disappearance reorganized his priorities. The investigation, meanwhile, began to reveal the complex landscape of a teenager's life that parents only partially understand. Maya's computer showed a browsing history typical of a college-bound 16-year-old, research on journalism programs, social media sites, music videos, and the occasional venture into chat rooms, where teenagers discussed everything from homework to heartbreak under assumed names. Detective Morrison spent hours reviewing Maya's online activity, learning the digital geography of her daily routine. She frequented a forum for aspiring journalists called Future Newsroom, where she posted under the username TruthSeeker07, and engaged in thoughtful discussions about media ethics and the responsibility of reporters. Her final post, made the Sunday before her disappearance, was a response to a thread about investigative journalism. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones happening right in front of us, in our own neighborhoods. We just don't know how to look for them yet. The prescience of those words would haunt the investigation. As autumn deepened into winter, the case attracted the attention of retired journalist Ellen Marsh, whose daughter had attended Lincoln High School a decade earlier. Ellen had spent 30 years covering crime for the Cedar Falls Gazette before taking early retirement to care for her aging mother. Maya's story stirred something in her, partly professional curiosity, partly maternal instinct, and partly the recognition of a kindred spirit in a young woman who shared her passion for uncovering truth. Ellen began her own informal investigation, driven by the journalist's fundamental belief that every story has answers if you ask the right questions of the right people. She spent hours at the Muddy River coffee shop, where high school students gathered after school, listening to conversations and building trust with teenagers who might remember something the official investigation had missed. What she discovered was a portrait of Maya Chen that differed subtly from the version that had emerged in the initial investigation. Yes, Maya was responsible and academically focused, but she was also quietly curious about the darker corners of her community. Jessica, Maya's best friend, eventually confided that Maya had been working on something in the weeks before her disappearance, some kind of personal research project that she had been secretive about. She said she was following a story. Jessica told Ellen over hot chocolate one snowy December afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. Something she couldn't talk about yet because she didn't have all the facts. But she was excited about it, like she had found something important. Ellen's journalist instincts sharpened. What story had Maya been pursuing? What facts had she been gathering? And why had she felt the need to keep her research secret? The answers proved elusive. Maya's locker had been cleaned out and reassigned. Her teachers remembered her as an excellent student, but couldn't recall any specific projects outside of regular coursework. The debate team advisor confirmed that Maya had been researching local government for an upcoming tournament, but nothing that would require secrecy or generate excitement. Ellen's investigation took an unexpected turn when she decided to visit Maya's favorite study spot, a quiet corner of the Carnegie Public Library, where Maya often spent Saturday afternoons working on college applications. The reference librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret who had worked there for 23 years, remembered Maya well. She was researching local history, Margaret recalled, her glasses reflecting the fluorescent library lights. Old newspaper archives, city council meeting minutes from the 1980s and 1990s. She said she was working on a family tree project, but Margaret paused, searching for the right words. It seemed more focused than that. More purposeful. She was taking very detailed notes. Ellen felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied a potential breakthrough. Family tree research might explain Maya's interest in local archives, but it wouldn't necessarily require secrecy or generate the kind of excitement Jessica had described. What had Maya been looking for in those old records? Unfortunately, the library's borrowing records only went back 5 years, and Maya had been accessing materials in the reference section that didn't require checkout. Margaret could remember her requesting specific years of the Cedar Falls Gazette archives, but couldn't recall which years or what stories Maya had been reviewing. As winter stretched toward spring, Ellen found herself developing a theory that both excited and worried her. Maya Chen, aspiring journalist, had stumbled onto something newsworthy in the course of her research. Something significant enough to capture her attention, and secretive enough to keep her from sharing details with her closest friend. Something that might have put her in danger. But what? And from whom? The official investigation continued its methodical work, following leads that led nowhere and pursuing tips that dissolved under scrutiny. Detective Morrison remained committed to finding Maya, but he was honest about the challenges. Without evidence of foul play, without witnesses to her disappearance, without any clear motive or suspect, the case had settled into the frustrating limbo that characterizes so many missing person investigations. Maya's parents established a scholarship fund in her name, ensuring that her memory would help other young journalists pursue their dreams. They gave interviews on the anniversary of her disappearance, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. They never stopped believing she would come home, even as rational parts of their minds began to prepare for the possibility that they might never know what happened to their daughter. And in the quiet spaces between active searching and painful waiting, Maya's story began to fade from public consciousness. Cedar Falls moved on, as communities do, carrying the weight of an unsolved mystery but not letting it stop the forward momentum of daily life. But Ellen Marsh couldn't let go. Something about Maya's story had gotten under her skin, the way the best investigations do. She kept a file folder on her kitchen table, adding newspaper clippings and notes from conversations, building a timeline that might eventually reveal the pattern she sensed but couldn't yet see. She had no way of knowing that 10 years later, that folder would become the foundation for something much larger, or that Maya's own words about finding stories in our own neighborhoods would prove to be prophetic in ways no one could have imagined. By 2012, 5 years after Maya's disappearance, the case had settled into the difficult rhythm of long-term uncertainty. The Chen family had learned to navigate birthdays and holidays shadowed by absence, marking time in the peculiar way that families of the missing must. Never quite grieving because death remains unconfirmed, never quite hoping because each passing day makes return seem less likely. Susan Chen had returned to her job as a nurse at Cedar Falls Community Hospital, finding solace in the concrete needs of others. The work grounded her in immediate problems with practical solutions, a dramatic change from the endless uncertainty that defined her home life. But even in the hospital's controlled environment, Maya's absence followed her. Every teenager who came through the emergency room, every family crisis that erupted in the waiting area, every parent's worried face reminded her of that Tuesday in October when her world had tilted off its axis. David had channeled his need for action into advocacy, joining organizations that supported families of missing persons and lobbying for improved Amber Alert systems. He testified before the Iowa legislature about gaps in missing person protocols, his voice steady but his hands shaking, as he described the first crucial hours after Maya's disappearance, when precious time was lost to bureaucratic procedures. Maya's case had generated a small but dedicated online community of amateur investigators who called themselves Maya's Army. They maintained a Facebook group with nearly 3,000 members, sharing theories and discussing potential leads with the passionate intensity of people who refused to let an injustice fade into obscurity. Some of their speculation was helpful, crowdsourcing searches of social media and public records that law enforcement didn't have resources to pursue. Some of it was less constructive, spinning elaborate conspiracy theories that distracted from factual investigation. Ellen Marsh remained the most persistent investigator, her journalist training keeping her focused on verifiable information, rather than speculation. She had continued her informal research, gradually building relationships with Maya's classmates as they graduated and moved into adult life. Many of them stayed in touch, checking in occasionally with new memories or insights about their missing friend. It was through one of these conversations that Ellen learned about the journalism club Maya had helped start during her sophomore year. The club had been informal, meeting after school once a week to discuss current events and practice interview techniques. It had disbanded after Maya's disappearance, but Ellen tracked down its former members, now college students scattered across the Midwest. Sarah Martinez, who had attended the University of Iowa to study communications, provided the most intriguing information. She and Maya had worked together on what they called investigative practice, choosing local issues to research as if they were real journalists working on actual stories. Maya was really good at finding the human angle. Sarah remembered during a phone conversation from her dorm room. We did a practice story about the old Riverside Shopping Center being torn down, and while I was focused on the economic impact, Maya kept asking questions about the families who had lived in the apartments above the stores. She wanted to know where they had gone, whether the city had helped them relocate. The Riverside Shopping Center had been demolished in late 2006 to make way for a new municipal complex. Ellen remembered the story, a brief flurry of city council meetings and newspaper articles about urban renewal and economic development. But Maya had apparently seen a different story underneath the official narrative. She said investigative journalism wasn't about big scandals. Sarah continued. It was about paying attention to the people who get overlooked when institutions make decisions. She wanted to be the kind of reporter who made sure everyone's story got told. Ellen felt the familiar quickening of interest that accompanied a potential lead. Maya's interest in displaced families aligned with her library research into city council meetings and local history. But what had she found? What story had she been pursuing in the weeks before her disappearance? The trail led Ellen to the Cedar Falls Housing Authority, where she spent an afternoon reviewing public records related to the Riverside development. The files revealed what anyone following the story closely would have known. The city had provided relocation assistance to most of the displaced tenants, helping them find comparable housing in other parts of town. Most, but not all. 3 families had apparently rejected the city's relocation offers and moved out of Cedar Falls entirely. Ellen found their names in the Housing Authority records. The Kowalski family, the Martinez family, no relation to Sarah, and a single mother named Catherine Walsh, who had been living above the old pharmacy with her teenage son. Ellen's investigation hit a wall when she tried to trace what had happened to these families. Public records showed they had left Cedar Falls, but provided no forwarding addresses or information about where they had gone. The Housing Authority supervisor, A pleasant but overwhelmed woman named Janet explained that her office wasn't required to track tenants after they left the system. "We offered them equivalent housing," Janet said, pulling Maya's case file from her records. "They chose to go elsewhere. That was their right." But Ellen's journalist instincts detected something incomplete about this explanation. Why would three families, all facing the same displacement, choose to leave town entirely rather than accept the city's assistance? What had Maya found in her research that made this angle worth pursuing? Unfortunately, Ellen's investigation stalled. Without access to sealed records or the authority to conduct official interviews, she couldn't penetrate the bureaucratic barriers that protected the privacy of former tenants. Maya's trail, whatever she had been following, remained cold. Meanwhile, the official investigation continued at a slower pace. Detective Morrison, now nearing retirement, maintained the case file and followed up on periodic tips, but he was honest about the limitations. After 5 years without significant new information, Maya's case had joined the ranks of long-term missing person investigations that required patience and luck more than active detective work. The annual vigil for Maya drew smaller crowds each year, but the core group of family and friends remained constant. They gathered in Lincoln High School's parking lot on the anniversary of her disappearance, sharing memories and lighting candles as October darkness settled over Cedar Falls. Susan Chen always spoke, her words carrying the accumulated weight of years without answers. Maya believed in the power of questions, Susan said at the 2012 vigil, her voice carrying across the parking lot where her daughter had last been seen. She believed that if we kept asking the right questions, we would eventually find the truth. So we keep asking. We keep searching. We keep believing that someone, somewhere, knows something that can bring our daughter home. The crowd dispersed quietly, candles flickering out one by one as people returned to cars and drove back to lives that had learned to accommodate Maya's absence. But Ellen Marsh lingered, standing near the school's front entrance, trying to imagine what Maya had been thinking as she walked through those doors for the last time. What questions had Maya been asking? What truth had she been seeking? And why, after 5 years, did Ellen still feel like the answers were hiding just beyond reach, waiting for the right person to ask the right question in the right way? She didn't know that 3 states away, a recent journalism graduate named Jake Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, was starting his first job at a small public radio station, developing a passion for true crime podcasting that would eventually bring him to Maya Chen's story. Or that social media and crowdsourced investigation techniques were evolving in ways that would soon make Ellen's solitary research efforts look quaint by comparison. The digital age was about to transform missing person investigations, and Maya's case was perfectly positioned to benefit from tools and techniques that didn't exist when she disappeared. But that transformation was still years away, and Ellen Marsh continued her quiet investigation, building a file that grew thicker with each passing month but no closer to answers. The 6th year of Maya's absence began like all the others, with hope tempered by experience, questions that multiplied instead of resolving, and the stubborn faith that somewhere in the accumulated details of an ordinary life lay the key to an extraordinary mystery. Jake Morrison had never intended to become a podcaster. His dream was to work for NPR, crafting thoughtful radio documentaries about social issues and human interest stories. But like many recent journalism graduates in 2014, he discovered that traditional media careers required navigating an increasingly challenging landscape of budget cuts and staff reductions. His job at KTCR, a small public radio station in Minneapolis, involved mostly mundane tasks, updating the community calendar, reading weather reports, and producing brief news segments about local government meetings. But KTCR's program director, sensing the growing popularity of podcasts, had given Jake permission to experiment with longer-form audio content during evening hours when the station's regular programming made way for automated music. Jake's first attempts at podcasting were earnest but amateurish. Interviews with local business owners, discussions of city council decisions, profiles of community volunteers. The shows attracted small but loyal audiences, mostly people who knew Jake personally or had a specific interest in the topics he covered. But Jake was learning, developing his voice and his instincts for storytelling, preparing for the opportunity that would define his career. That opportunity came in the form of Ellen Marsh's letter. Ellen had been following the emergence of podcasting with the interest of a lifelong journalist who recognized the new medium's potential. Shows like Serial had demonstrated how audio storytelling could bring fresh attention to cold cases, engaging audiences in ways that traditional media coverage couldn't match. When she read about Jake's work on KTCR's website, something about his approach resonated with her. His focus on local stories, his commitment to thorough research, his evident respect for the people whose stories he told. Her letter to Jake was direct but passionate, outlining Maya Chen's case and her own 7 years of informal investigation. She included copies of her research files, dozens of pages of notes and documents that revealed the depth of her commitment to finding answers. But what captured Jake's attention wasn't the accumulated evidence. It was Ellen's description of Maya herself. She was like you, Ellen wrote. A young journalist who believed that asking the right questions could uncover important truths. She disappeared while pursuing a story, and I think her own approach to investigation might be the key to understanding what happened to her. Jake found himself drawn into Maya's story with an intensity that surprised him. Perhaps it was the professional kinship Ellen had identified, or maybe it was the particular challenge of a case that had stumped experienced investigators for nearly 8 years. But as he reviewed Ellen's files and began his own preliminary research, Jake felt the familiar excitement of a journalist sensing a significant story. He pitched the idea to his program director as a limited series, 6 episodes exploring Maya's disappearance and the investigation that followed. The format would allow Jake to dive deep into the case while maintaining the narrative structure that made podcasts compelling. He would interview everyone involved, review all available evidence, and use the podcast itself as an investigative tool, hoping that public attention might generate new leads. Finding Maya premiered in March 2017, exactly 10 years after Maya Chen's disappearance. Jake had spent months preparing, conducting interviews with Maya's family and friends, reviewing police files, and building relationships with everyone connected to the case. His first episode opened with audio from Maya's high school debate team, her voice captured on a recording from 2006 as she argued passionately about media literacy and the responsibility of journalists to serve their communities. The sound of Maya's actual voice, preserved on aging equipment from Lincoln High School's Media Center, created an immediate emotional connection that surprised even Jake. Listeners could hear not just her words but her passion, her intelligence, her fundamental decency. She became real in ways that photographs and written descriptions couldn't accomplish. Jake's approach differed from traditional true crime podcasts in significant ways. Instead of focusing primarily on potential suspects or dramatic theories, he treated Maya's story as she would have approached it, as a piece of investigative journalism that required patience, respect for sources, and commitment to factual accuracy. He interviewed Maya's family with sensitivity, spending hours with Susan and David Chen to ensure that their daughter was portrayed as a complex person rather than a tragic symbol. But Jake also brought new tools and techniques to the investigation. His podcast reached audiences far beyond Cedar Falls, and he used social media strategically to crowdsource information. The Facebook group, Maya's Army, had grown to over 8,000 members, and Jake worked with its administrators to channel their enthusiasm into productive research. Most importantly, Jake approached the case with fresh eyes and a different generational perspective. While Ellen Marsh had focused on traditional investigative techniques, interviewing sources, reviewing documents, following paper trails, Jake understood how digital communication and social media had changed the landscape of teenage life even between 2007 and 2017. His breakthrough came in the 3rd episode, when he decided to systematically contact everyone who had been in Maya's graduating class. Social media made this kind of outreach possible in ways that hadn't existed when Maya disappeared. Jake created a simple online form that allowed former classmates to share memories or information anonymously, removing the pressure of formal police interviews while still generating potentially useful leads. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Jake received dozens of submissions within the first week, most containing variations of the same information that had been covered in the original investigation. But a few responses stood out, providing new perspectives on Maya's final weeks that had been missed or overlooked during the initial inquiry. A former classmate named Marcus Williams, who had moved to Portland after graduation and rarely kept in touch with anyone from Cedar Falls, submitted a detailed account of a conversation he had overheard in the school library 2 weeks before Maya's disappearance. Marcus had been studying for a calculus exam at a table near the reference section when he noticed Maya having an intense discussion with someone on her cell phone. She was trying to keep her voice down, Marcus wrote, but she seemed upset or frustrated about something. I remember her saying, "But they have a right to know what really happened," and then a few minutes later, "I can't just ignore this because it's complicated. I didn't think much about it at the time. I figured it was something about the debate team or student government. But after she disappeared, I kept wondering if that conversation was important. This account aligned with other evidence suggesting Maya had been working on some kind of research project in the weeks before her disappearance. But Marcus's submission provided the first suggestion that Maya's investigation might have involved ethical concerns, questions about truth-telling and responsibility that went beyond academic research. Jake followed up with Marcus, conducting a phone interview that provided additional details. The conversation had lasted about 15 minutes, and Maya had seemed increasingly agitated as it progressed. Marcus couldn't remember exact words, but he had gotten the impression that Maya was trying to convince someone to take action, or perhaps trying to decide whether to take action herself. She had this notebook with her, Marcus recalled during their phone conversation, a spiral notebook that she was flipping through while she talked. She kept checking something, like she was referencing notes or facts. When she finished the call, she sat there for a long time just staring at whatever was written in that notebook. Jake felt the excitement of a genuine breakthrough. Maya's notebook had never been found. It wasn't in her locker, her backpack, or anywhere in her bedroom. Police had assumed she had been carrying it when she disappeared, but now Jake wondered if the notebook might be the key to understanding what Maya had been investigating. But finding a notebook that had been missing for 10 years seemed impossible. Jake was learning that podcast investigation involved the same frustrations as traditional detective work, tantalizing clues that led nowhere, promising leads that dissolved under scrutiny, the constant tension between hope and disappointment. However, Jake's podcast was generating something that the original investigation had lacked: sustained public attention and engagement. Finding Maya was attracting thousands of listeners, and many of them were actively participating in the investigation through social media and online forums. Tips and theories poured in daily, requiring Jake to develop systems for evaluating and following up on information. Most tips were well-intentioned but unhelpful. Sightings of Maya in distant cities, theories about elaborate conspiracies, suggestions that she had deliberately disappeared to start a new life. But some contained genuinely useful information that advanced Jake's understanding of the case. A listener named Patricia Walsh contacted Jake after hearing the third episode. The name Walsh had appeared in Ellen Marsh's research as one of the families displaced by the Riverside Shopping Center development, but Ellen had been unable to locate them for follow-up interviews. Patricia explained that Catherine Walsh was her aunt, and that Catherine and her son Danny had indeed left Cedar Falls after their apartment above the pharmacy was demolished. But their departure hadn't been voluntary, as the official records suggested. "My aunt was scared," Patricia told Jake during a recorded phone interview. Something had happened that made her feel unsafe, and when the city forced them to move, she saw it as an opportunity to get out of town entirely. Jake felt his pulse quicken. This was the first suggestion that Maya's investigation into displaced families might have uncovered something genuinely disturbing. But when he asked Patricia for more details, she became evasive. "I can't really say more," she said. "My aunt made me promise never to talk about what happened in Cedar Falls, but I think if someone was investigating what happened to those families, they might have been in danger, especially if they were asking the right questions." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jake with more questions than answers, but convinced that he was finally on the right track. Maya Chen had been investigating something related to the displaced families from Riverside Shopping Center. Her investigation had revealed information that someone considered dangerous, and that someone might have been willing to silence a persistent teenage journalist who was getting too close to the truth. As Jake prepared for his fourth episode, he realized that his podcast had evolved beyond simply retelling Maya's story. He was actively investigating her disappearance, using tools and techniques that hadn't been available to the original investigators. And for the first time in 10 years, he was beginning to believe that the truth might actually be discoverable. But he was also beginning to understand that some truths come with risks, and that Maya Chen might have paid the ultimate price for her commitment to journalism's fundamental principle: the public's right to know. Jake Morrison's fourth episode of Finding Maya aired in April 2017, and within hours of its release, his podcast had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across 3 states. The episode, titled The Missing Notebook, presented Jake's most detailed analysis of Maya's final weeks, including the new information from Marcus Williams and Patricia Walsh that suggested Maya had been investigating something that someone considered dangerous. But the episode's most significant moment came near the end, when Jake made a direct appeal to his listeners that would ultimately crack the case wide open. Somewhere out there Jake said, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of months of investigation. "Someone has information that could bring Maya Chen home to her family. Maybe you worked for the city in 2006 and 2007. Maybe you knew one of the families who lived above the stores at Riverside Shopping Center. Maybe you remember seeing something, hearing something, or being told something that didn't seem important at the time but might matter now." Jake provided multiple ways for people to contact him: email, phone, social media, an anonymous tip line. He emphasized that no piece of information was too small, no memory too vague to be potentially useful. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Jake's email inbox filled with hundreds of messages. His phone rang constantly. The podcast's social media accounts were flooded with tips, theories, and offers of assistance from listeners who had become emotionally invested in Maya's story. Most of the responses were variations on information Jake had already received, well-intentioned but not immediately helpful. But on the third day after the episode's release, Jake received an email that changed everything. The message came from someone who identified himself only as a friend of the truth and provided a Gmail address that appeared to have been created specifically for this communication. The email was brief but specific. "Jake, I've been listening to your podcast and I think I know what Maya Chen was investigating. I can't talk on the phone and I can't meet in person, but if you're serious about finding the truth, look into what really happened to the Martinez family. They didn't just move away from Cedar Falls. And the person who knows what happened to them might also know what happened to Maya. Check the records at St. Catherine's Hospital for October 2006. Ask about Danny Walsh." Jake stared at his computer screen, reading the message multiple times. The Martinez family had been one of the 3 families Ellen Marsh had identified as rejecting the city's relocation assistance. Danny Walsh was the teenage son of Catherine Walsh, another family that had left town under mysterious circumstances. And St. Catherine's Hospital was located in Waterloo, about 20 minutes from Cedar Falls. Jake forwarded the email to Ellen Marsh, who had become his unofficial research partner and fact-checker. Her response came within an hour. "This is the first concrete lead we've had that connects Maya's investigation to specific people and places. I'm driving to Waterloo tomorrow to check hospital records. Do you want to meet me there?" Jake arranged to take a personal day from KTCR and drove to Waterloo the next morning, his recording equipment packed in case the day produced material worth including in future episodes. He met Ellen at the hospital's main entrance, both of them uncertain about what they might find, but convinced that they were finally pursuing the right thread. St. Catherine's Hospital maintained patient privacy with appropriate seriousness, but Jake's press credentials and Ellen's experience as a former journalist opened doors that might have remained closed to private citizens. The hospital's public relations coordinator, a helpful woman named Sandra Collins, agreed to review their request and see what public information might be available. "We can't provide specific patient records," Sandra explained as she led them to her office, "but if you're looking into a matter of public safety or criminal activity, we might be able to confirm whether certain incidents were reported to authorities." Jake explained that they were investigating the disappearance of Maya Chen and believed it might be connected to families who had lived in Cedar Falls in 2006 and 2007. He mentioned Danny Walsh specifically, hoping that the name might trigger recognition. Sandra's expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she heard Danny's name, and Jake sensed that they had hit on something significant. "Let me make some calls," Sandra said, excusing herself from the office. She returned 30 minutes later with a thin file folder and a carefully neutral expression. "Daniel Walsh was treated here in October 2006 for injuries consistent with physical assault," she said, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood legal implications. "The case was reported to local law enforcement, but I don't have information about what happened with that investigation." Jake felt his heart racing. Danny Walsh had been assaulted in October 2006, just weeks before his mother moved him out of Cedar Falls. This was the first concrete evidence that something violent had happened to one of the displaced families. "Can you tell us anything else about the nature of his injuries?" Ellen asked gently. Sandra consulted the file again. The attending physician's notes indicate that Daniel was a 17-year-old male who presented with facial lacerations, bruised ribs, and defensive wounds on his hands and arms. The injuries were photographed and documented as part of a potential criminal case. Jake was recording the conversation with Sandra's permission, but he found himself taking additional notes, his handwriting growing increasingly urgent as the implications of this information became clear. "Do your records indicate who reported the assault?" Jake asked. "That information would be in the police report," Sandra replied. "But I can tell you that Daniel Walsh was brought to the hospital by his mother, Catherine Walsh, and that she specifically requested that the case be reported to authorities outside of Cedar Falls." The significance of this detail was immediate and chilling. Catherine Walsh had been so concerned about her son's safety that she had bypassed local law enforcement entirely, requesting that the assault be reported to county or state authorities instead. Jake and Ellen left the hospital with a new understanding of Maya Chen's investigation. She hadn't simply been researching displaced families as a human interest story. She had been investigating a pattern of violence or intimidation that had forced families to leave Cedar Falls, and her research had led her to discover that at least one teenager had been seriously assaulted. But this breakthrough raised as many questions as it answered. Who had attacked Danny Walsh? Why had his mother felt unsafe reporting the assault to Cedar Falls police? And how had Maya learned about the connection between the assault and the family's departure from town? Jake's investigation took on new urgency. He reached out to the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department, which would have handled any report that bypassed Cedar Falls police. After several phone calls and a formal records request, he learned that the assault on Danny Walsh had indeed been investigated by county authorities in late 2006. The case file made for disturbing reading. Danny Walsh had been attacked by 3 adult men while walking home from his job at a grocery store. The attackers had specifically mentioned his family's resistance to leaving their apartment above the pharmacy, suggesting that the assault was intended to intimidate the Walsh family into accepting the city's relocation offer. Even more troubling, the case file indicated that Danny Walsh had initially planned to press charges against his attackers, whom he had been able to identify. But within 2 weeks of the assault, Catherine Walsh had contacted the sheriff's department to withdraw the complaint and announced that she and her son were leaving Iowa permanently. Jake found himself constructing a timeline that painted an increasingly dark picture of what had happened in Cedar Falls during the fall of 2006. The city's urban renewal project had displaced several families, most of whom had accepted relocation assistance and found new housing locally. But the 3 families who had resisted the city's offers, the Kowalskis, the Martinezis, and the Walshes, had apparently faced escalating pressure to leave town. Danny Walsh's assault was the only incident that had been formally reported, but Jake suspected it might not have been the only act of intimidation. His anonymous emailer had specifically mentioned the Martinez family, suggesting that they too had experienced something beyond ordinary displacement. Jake's 5th episode, released in May 2017, detailed the discovery of Danny Walsh's assault and its apparent connection to the Riverside Shopping Center development. The episode raised serious questions about whether Maya Chen had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to force families out of Cedar Falls through intimidation and violence. The response to this episode was immediate and intense. Jake's email filled with messages from listeners who were outraged by the suggestion that local officials might have been involved in covering up criminal activity. But he also received several messages that provided additional pieces of the puzzle. A former grocery store clerk named Maria Santos contacted Jake to report that she remembered Danny Walsh from his job at the store where she had worked in 2006. She recalled that Danny had been nervous and jumpy in the weeks before his assault, mentioning to coworkers that his family was receiving threatening phone calls about their apartment. He said someone had been calling late at night. Maria told Jake during a recorded phone interview, telling his mom that bad things happened to people who didn't cooperate with the city's plans. Danny was scared, but he was also angry. He kept saying it wasn't right, that someone should do something about it. Another listener, a former Cedar Falls city employee who requested anonymity, provided information about the internal politics surrounding the Riverside development. The project had been controversial, he explained, with some council members expressing concerns about the aggressive timeline and the pressure being placed on reluctant tenants. There were people who wanted that development to happen fast and clean, the former employee told Jake, without the complications of holdout tenants or negative publicity. Some of us worried that the pressure on families was getting out of hand, but we were told not to interfere with the relocation process. Jake was beginning to understand that Maya Chen had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple story about displaced families. She had apparently uncovered evidence of systematic intimidation designed to clear out tenants who were interfering with a politically and economically important development project. But the most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who had been Maya's AP history teacher, contacted Jake after hearing his 5th episode. She had been reluctant to speak publicly about Maya's final weeks, she explained. because she hadn't been certain that her observations were relevant to the investigation. Maya came to see me about 3 weeks before she disappeared, Dr. Hernandez told Jake during a phone interview. She was working on what she called an independent research project about local government and community development. She had discovered something in her research that troubled her, and she wanted to discuss the ethical implications of what she had learned. Jake felt the familiar excitement of a crucial breakthrough. Can you tell me more about what troubled her? Dr. Hernandez paused, choosing her words carefully. Maya had found evidence that city officials were using unofficial methods to pressure families into accepting relocation offers. She had documentation of threats, intimidation, and at least one instance of violence. But she was struggling with what to do with this information. What kind of documentation? Jake asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. She had copies of police reports, hospital records, and what she described as witness statements from people who had been threatened or intimidated. Maya was methodical. She had built a comprehensive case file that proved city officials were aware of the intimidation and had chosen not to intervene. Jake realized that he was finally learning about the contents of Maya's missing notebook. She hadn't just been taking casual notes about displaced families. She had been building a documented case against city officials who had allowed or encouraged criminal activity to advance a development project. Did she tell you what she planned to do with this evidence? Jake asked. Dr. Hernandez's answer would haunt Jake for months to come. She said she was going to take it to the police. Maya believed that once law enforcement saw the evidence she had gathered, they would have to investigate and hold people accountable. She was naive about how complicated these situations can be, how many interests are involved in major development projects. She thought justice was simply a matter of presenting the truth to the right authorities. Jake ended the call with a clear understanding of what had likely happened to Maya Chen. She had investigated a conspiracy involving city officials and criminal intimidation. She had gathered evidence that could have destroyed careers and exposed corruption. And she had been planning to take that evidence to the police just days before her disappearance. The 6th and final episode of Finding Maya would have to confront the most difficult questions Jake had encountered in his investigation. What had happened when Maya tried to report her findings? Who had been threatened by her investigation? And how far would they have gone to silence a persistent teenage journalist who refused to let an injustice go unexposed? Jake Morrison's investigation had reached a critical juncture by the summer of 2017. The evidence he had gathered painted a disturbing picture of corruption, intimidation, and possibly murder, but he still lacked the definitive proof that would bring Maya Chen home to her family. The 6th episode of Finding Maya would require him to confront the most dangerous part of his investigation, identifying the specific individuals who might have been threatened by Maya's research. Jake spent weeks preparing for this episode, consulting with attorneys about legal implications and coordinating with law enforcement to ensure that his investigation didn't interfere with any official proceedings. Detective Morrison, who had maintained Maya's case file for 10 years, agreed to cooperate with Jake's podcast on the condition that any evidence of criminal activity would be immediately shared with appropriate authorities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Catherine Walsh, Danny's mother, contacted Jake directly after hearing his 5th episode. She had been living in Oregon for over a decade, working as a nurse and trying to help her son recover from the trauma he had experienced in Cedar Falls. But hearing her story discussed on the podcast had convinced her that staying silent was no longer protecting anyone. I need to tell you what really happened, Catherine said during their first phone conversation, her voice shaking with 10 years of suppressed fear and anger. Danny and I left Cedar Falls because I was afraid someone was going to kill us. And I think Maya Chen was killed because she found out the same things we knew. Catherine's story provided the missing pieces that Jake had been searching for. Her family had lived above the pharmacy at Riverside Shopping Center for 3 years, before the development project began. When the city announced plans to demolish the building, Catherine had initially been willing to accept relocation assistance, but she discovered that the offered housing was significantly more expensive and located in a part of town with poor schools and limited public transportation. As a single mother working 2 jobs to support herself and Danny, Catherine couldn't afford the higher rent, and Danny couldn't easily get to his job at the grocery store from the proposed new location. She petitioned the city council for assistance with the rent difference or help finding alternative housing that met her family's needs. That's when the problems began. At first it was just phone calls, Catherine told Jake. Someone would call late at night and tell me I needed to stop causing trouble for the development project. They said I was being selfish, that I was holding up progress for the whole community. When Catherine continued advocating for her family's needs at city council meetings, the harassment escalated. She found her car tires slashed. Someone threw a brick through the pharmacy window with a note telling her to, quote, "Take the city's offer and get out." Danny began receiving anonymous threats at school and at work. "I went to the police," Catherine continued, "but they said there wasn't much they could do about anonymous threats. They suggested that maybe I should reconsider the city's relocation offer, that it would be easier for everyone if I just moved on." The assault on Danny had been the final straw. Catherine realized that staying in Cedar Falls meant putting her son's life in danger, so she accepted a job offer in Oregon and left town within 2 weeks of Danny's attack. But before leaving, Catherine had documented everything. The threatening phone calls, the vandalism, the police reports that went nowhere, and the names of the people who had made it clear that her family was no longer welcome in Cedar Falls. "I kept copies of everything," Catherine told Jake. "I was afraid that if I ever tried to come back or tell anyone what happened, I would need proof. And I was right to be afraid, because apparently a teenage girl tried to tell the same story, and look what happened to her." Jake felt his pulse racing as Catherine described the evidence she had preserved. Her documentation would provide the foundation for proving that Maya's investigation had uncovered real criminal activity, not just teenage conspiracy theories. But Catherine's most significant revelation concerned the identity of the people who had orchestrated the intimidation campaign. It wasn't just random criminals, she explained. The threats were coming from people connected to the development project, construction contractors, city employees, people who had financial interests in making sure the project went forward without delays or complications. Catherine provided Jake with names, dates, and documentation that painted a picture of systematic corruption involving multiple city officials and private contractors. The Riverside development had been a multi-million-dollar project with significant political and economic implications. Delays caused by holdout tenants threatened to cost the developers substantial money and potentially kill the project entirely. Jake realized that Maya Chen had uncovered the same information Catherine Walsh possessed. Maya's methodical investigation had revealed that city officials were aware of the intimidation campaign, but had chosen not to intervene because they were financially and politically invested in the development project's success. The most damaging evidence involved Thomas Brennan, who had served as Cedar Falls Director of Community Development from 2005 to 2008. Brennan had been the primary city official responsible for managing the tenant relocation process, and Catherine's documentation showed that he had been in regular contact with the contractors who were threatening holdout families. Brennan told me directly that if I didn't accept the city's offer, I shouldn't expect any protection from the Cedar Falls Police Department, Catherine told Jake. He said the city had invested too much in the project to let a few stubborn tenants destroy everyone's future. Jake spent days fact-checking Catherine's allegations, cross-referencing her documentation with public records and news coverage from 2006 and 2007. Everything aligned with the timeline of Maya's investigation and disappearance. Thomas Brennan had left his position with the city in early 2008, citing family obligations, but Jake discovered that he had actually been forced out after questions arose about his handling of the Riverside project. He had moved to Kansas City, where he worked as a private development consultant. Jake's investigation took on new urgency as he realized that he was pursuing someone who might have been directly responsible for Maya's disappearance. Working with Detective Morrison, Jake learned that Brennan had never been formally investigated in connection with Maya's case, despite the clear timeline connecting his problems with the development project to her disappearance. But when Jake tried to contact Brennan for comment, he discovered that tracking down a private consultant who had been avoiding scrutiny for over a decade was more challenging than he had anticipated. Brennan's consulting firm had closed in 2015, and his last known address was a Kansas City apartment that he had vacated 2 years earlier. Jake's 6th episode, released in June 2017, detailed Catherine Walsh's story and identified Thomas Brennan as a person of interest in Maya's disappearance. The episode was Jake's most explosive yet, presenting clear evidence that Maya had been investigating documented criminal activity involving city officials. The response was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of the episode's release, Jake received a call from the Cedar Falls Police Department requesting that he come in for an official interview about his investigation. Detective Morrison, now working closely with state authorities, wanted to review all of Jake's evidence and interview his sources as part of a reopened investigation into Maya's disappearance. But the call that changed everything came the next morning. Jake's phone rang at 6:47 a.m., waking him from restless sleep. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but Jake had been answering all calls since the podcast began, hoping that each one might provide the final piece of Maya's puzzle. "Is this Jake Morrison?" the caller asked, his voice nervous but determined. "Yes, this is Jake. My name is Danny Walsh. I heard your podcast, and I think it's time I told someone what really happened the night Maya Chen disappeared." Jake sat up in bed, suddenly completely awake. Danny Walsh had been living in Oregon with his mother for over a decade, working as a carpenter, and trying to put his traumatic experience in Cedar Falls behind him. But hearing his family's story on the podcast had convinced him that staying silent was no longer an option. "I saw Maya the night she disappeared," Danny told Jake, his voice carrying the weight of 10 years of guilty silence. "She came to our apartment to interview my mom about what had happened to us. She had evidence about the people who attacked me, and she wanted to include our story in something she was putting together to take to the police." Jake felt his hands shaking as he fumbled for his recording equipment. This was the breakthrough he had been hoping for, a witness who could place Maya at a specific location on the night of her disappearance. "Can you tell me more about that interview?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Danny's answer would provide the final pieces of Maya Chen's story, but it would also reveal that the truth about her disappearance was more complex and more tragic than anyone had imagined. "Maya never made it to our apartment," Danny said quietly. "I was supposed to meet her at the pharmacy at 8 o'clock, to let her in through the back door so she could interview my mom without anyone seeing her. But when I got there, Thomas Brennan was waiting instead." Danny Walsh's testimony provided the missing piece that connected Maya Chen's investigation to her disappearance, but his account revealed a tragedy that was both simpler and more complex than the conspiracy theories that had surrounded the case for 10 years. "I waited for Maya until almost 9 o'clock, Danny told Jake during their recorded phone conversation, his voice heavy with a decade of suppressed guilt. "Brennan had been watching our building for weeks, making sure we knew we were being monitored. When Maya didn't show up for our meeting, I assumed she had gotten scared and decided not to come. I was actually relieved, because I was afraid of what might happen if Brennan found out we were talking to someone about what had happened to us." Jake listened with growing tension as Danny described the events of October 16, 2007. Maya had contacted Catherine Walsh through an intermediary, a social worker who had helped the family after Danny's assault, and arranged to interview Catherine about the intimidation campaign that had forced them to leave Cedar Falls. The interview was supposed to be the final piece of evidence Maya needed to present a comprehensive case to law enforcement. But Thomas Brennan had apparently been monitoring the Walsh family's communications and learned about the planned meeting. "The next morning, Brennan came to our apartment," Danny continued. "He was different than before, not threatening, but almost apologetic. He told us that the high school girl who had been investigating the development project had been in a car accident the night before, and that we shouldn't expect anyone else to come asking questions about what had happened to us." Danny's account aligned with the official timeline of Maya's disappearance, but it provided a crucial detail that had been missing from the investigation. Maya hadn't simply vanished after leaving school. She had been on her way to a specific destination for a specific purpose when something had prevented her from reaching the Walsh family's apartment. Jake pressed Danny for more details about Brennan's visit and his claim that Maya had been in a car accident. "He didn't give us any details," Danny said. "Just that there had been an accident, and that the girl wouldn't be bothering anyone anymore. But the way he said it—" Danny paused, struggling to find the right words. It didn't sound like he was reporting an accident. It sounded like he was taking credit for something. This revelation transformed Jake's understanding of the case. For 10 years, investigators had been searching for evidence of what had happened to Maya after she left school. But Danny's testimony suggested that Maya's disappearance had been planned and executed by someone who knew about her investigation and her intended movements that evening. Jake immediately contacted Detective Morrison and shared Danny's account. Within hours, law enforcement agencies in 3 states were coordinating an intensive investigation into Thomas Brennan's whereabouts and activities in October 2007. But the investigation took an unexpected turn when Jake received a call from his podcast legal advisor. "Jake, I need to tell you something important," attorney Sarah Rodriguez said, her voice unusually serious. "Thomas Brennan contacted me this morning. He wants to speak with you directly about Maya Chen's disappearance." Jake felt his heart racing. After months of searching for Brennan, the man was voluntarily coming forward to respond to the podcast's allegations. "He's willing to meet with you and law enforcement," Sarah continued, "but he has some conditions. He wants immunity from prosecution in exchange for telling the truth about what happened to Maya Chen." The meeting was arranged for the following week at the offices of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation in Des Moines. Jake would be allowed to record the interview for his podcast, but law enforcement would take the lead in questioning Brennan about his potential involvement in Maya's disappearance. Thomas Brennan appeared older and more fragile than Jake had expected. The man, who had once wielded significant political power in Cedar Falls, looked tired and defeated, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had been running from something for a very long time. But Brennan's account of Maya's disappearance was both shocking and heartbreaking in its mundane horror. Maya Chen called me directly on October 16th, Brennan told the assembled investigators, his voice barely above a whisper. She said she had evidence of criminal activity related to the Riverside development and that she was going to take it to the police unless I agreed to meet with her first. Brennan explained that Maya had been remarkably thorough in her investigation, uncovering documentation and witness testimony that could have led to criminal charges against multiple city officials and private contractors. Her evidence was detailed enough to destroy careers and potentially result in prison sentences for several people involved in the intimidation campaign. I agreed to meet her at the old grain elevator on Highway 218, Brennan continued, referring to an abandoned agricultural facility on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. I thought I could convince her that her evidence was incomplete, that she didn't understand the full context of what had happened during the development project. But the meeting had gone wrong in ways that Brennan claimed he hadn't anticipated. Maya was angry, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. She wasn't interested in explanations or justifications. She wanted to know why we had allowed families to be threatened and attacked, why we had protected criminals instead of victims. She had this notebook full of evidence, and she kept reading from it, listing specific incidents and dates and names. Brennan claimed that he had tried to convince Maya to abandon her investigation by offering to ensure that the intimidation stopped and that the affected families received appropriate compensation, but Maya had refused to be bought off or silenced. She said that what we had done was criminal and that covering it up would make us accessories after the fact, Brennan recalled. She said she had a responsibility as a journalist to expose the truth, regardless of the consequences for the people involved. The confrontation had escalated when Brennan realized that Maya's evidence was comprehensive enough to destroy not just his career, but the careers of several other people who had been involved in the development project. I grabbed her notebook, Brennan said, his voice now barely audible. I just wanted to see how much evidence she really had, how bad the situation was. But Maya fought back, trying to get the notebook away from me. What happened next was the kind of tragic accident that could have been avoided if any one of a dozen decisions had been made differently. We were struggling over the notebook near the edge of the grain elevator platform, Brennan continued, tears now streaming down his face. Maya was pulling on one side, I was pulling on the other. The railing was old and corroded. When Maya pulled backward, the railing gave way. Maya had fallen 30 feet into the grain storage silo below the platform. Brennan claimed that he had immediately climbed down to help her, but she had died from her injuries before he could get emergency assistance. I panicked, Brennan said. I knew that if I reported the accident, everything Maya had investigated would come out. I knew that people would assume I had pushed her deliberately. I knew my life was over. Instead of calling for help, Brennan had made a series of decisions that turned a tragic accident into a decade-long cover-up. He had buried Maya's body in a remote section of the grain elevator property and disposed of her notebook and backpack. He had then returned to Cedar Falls and continued his normal routine, hoping that Maya's disappearance would be treated as a runaway case that would eventually be forgotten. I never meant for her to be hurt, Brennan insisted, though his claims of innocence rang hollow given his subsequent actions. I just wanted to protect myself and the other people who would have been destroyed by her investigation. But I've been living with this guilt for 10 years and I can't carry it anymore. Jake felt a complex mixture of emotions as he listened to Brennan's confession. Relief that Maya's family would finally have answers. Anger that a 16-year-old girl had died because adults were more interested in protecting their careers than confronting their crimes. Sadness that Maya's commitment to truth and justice had cost her everything. But Brennan's confession also raised difficult questions about accountability and justice. Even if his account was true, that Maya's death had been accidental rather than intentional murder. His decision to cover up the death and let the Chen family suffer for 10 years demonstrated a callousness that was difficult to comprehend. The investigation moved quickly after Brennan's confession. Law enforcement teams searched the abandoned grain elevator and found Maya's remains exactly where Brennan had described. Her notebook was recovered from a nearby storage shed, its pages still containing the methodical documentation of corruption and criminal activity that had cost Maya her life. Jake's 7th episode, released in August 2017, detailed Brennan's confession and the discovery of Maya's remains. The episode was difficult to produce, requiring Jake to balance respect for the Chen family's grief with the public's need to understand how a teenage journalist's commitment to truth had led to tragedy. But the episode also provided a form of closure that the Chen family had been denied for 10 years. Susan and David Chen could finally grieve their daughter's death instead of living in the limbo of uncertainty. Maya could be laid to rest with the dignity and recognition she deserved. Maya's funeral, held 10 years after her disappearance, drew thousands of people from across Iowa and beyond. Journalists, students, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her story came to pay their respects to a young woman who had died pursuing the principles that define good journalism at its best. The investigation into the corruption Maya had uncovered continued long after her burial. Several former city officials were charged with conspiracy and civil rights violations. The families who had been intimidated and displaced received compensation for their suffering. And Maya's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can arise when institutional power prioritizes economic interests over human dignity. But for Jake Morrison, Maya's story was more than just a podcast or an investigation. It was a reminder of why journalism matters, why someone needs to ask difficult questions and pursue uncomfortable truths, even when powerful people would prefer silence. As Jake prepared for his final episode, he found himself thinking about Maya's unfinished college essay, the cursor that had been blinking after her incomplete sentence about telling the stories of ordinary people. Maya had never gotten to finish that thought, but her own story had revealed exactly what she had been trying to articulate, that the most important truths are often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to notice and persistent enough to investigate. Jake Morrison's final episode of Finding Maya aired on October 16, 2017, exactly 10 years after Maya Chen had walked out of Lincoln High School for the last time. The episode, titled The Story Continues, served as both an epilogue to Maya's investigation and a reflection on the broader implications of her life and death. Thomas Brennan pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice, receiving a sentence of 12 years in prison. His plea agreement required him to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into the corruption that Maya had uncovered, leading to additional charges against 3 former city officials and 2 private contractors who had been involved in the intimidation campaign against displaced families. The Chen family established the Maya Chen Foundation for investigative journalism, providing scholarships and internships for young journalists who demonstrated Maya's commitment to truth and social justice. The foundation's mission statement, written by Susan Chen, captured the essence of her daughter's brief but meaningful life. Maya believed that journalism's highest purpose was to give voice to those who had been silenced and to hold powerful institutions accountable for their treatment of ordinary people. But the most significant aspect of Maya's legacy was the way her story had demonstrated the power of persistence and collaboration in uncovering truth. Jake's podcast had succeeded where traditional investigation had failed because it had engaged thousands of listeners in the search for answers, crowdsourcing information and attention in ways that weren't possible when Maya disappeared in 2007. Ellen Marsh, whose 7 years of quiet investigation had provided the foundation for Jake's breakthrough, reflected on the collaborative nature of the search for Maya. Maya was right when she said that the most important stories are often hiding in plain sight, Ellen told Jake during an interview for the final episode. But sometimes it takes a community of people asking questions to finally see what's been there all along. The impact of Finding Maya extended far beyond solving a single missing person case. The podcast had generated national attention to the issue of corruption in local government and the vulnerability of citizens who challenge powerful interests. Several other communities began investigating their own development projects and displacement policies, leading to reforms designed to protect tenants, rights, and prevent the kind of intimidation that had victimized families in Cedar Falls. Maya's story also highlighted the particular dangers faced by young journalists who pursue investigations into local corruption. The Chen family worked with journalism schools and professional organizations to develop safety protocols for student journalists, ensuring that future investigators would have support and protection when pursuing sensitive stories. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Maya's legacy was the way her story had demonstrated the enduring relevance of the principles she had lived by. In an era of increasing skepticism about journalism and growing hostility toward reporters, Maya's commitment to truth and justice served as a reminder of why the profession matters. Jake found himself changed by his investigation into Maya's disappearance. The experience had taught him that journalism at its best requires not just technical skills and professional training, but moral courage and genuine compassion for the people whose stories need to be told. Maya had possessed these qualities at 16, demonstrating a maturity and integrity that many experienced journalists struggle to maintain throughout their careers. The response to finding Maya was overwhelming, with the podcast downloading millions of times and generating coverage in national media outlets. But Jake was most moved by the personal messages he received from listeners who had been inspired by Maya's example to pursue their own investigations into local injustices, or to simply pay closer attention to the treatment of vulnerable people in their communities. One message came from a high school senior in Nebraska who had started investigating why several low-income families in her town had been evicted from an apartment complex that was subsequently demolished for a luxury development. Another came from a college journalism student who had uncovered evidence of discriminatory lending practices at a local bank. Maya's story had shown them that important journalism could be done by anyone willing to ask the right questions and persist in seeking answers. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Maya's former AP history teacher, helped establish an annual Maya Chen Memorial Lecture at Lincoln High School, bringing professional journalists to speak with students about the responsibilities and opportunities of their profession. The first lecture was delivered by Jake Morrison, who spoke about the lessons he had learned from investigating Maya's disappearance. Maya Chen taught me that journalism isn't just about reporting events after they happen. Jake told the assembled students, standing in the same auditorium where Maya had once delivered debate speeches and participated in school assemblies. It's about paying attention to patterns of injustice and asking why those patterns exist. It's about believing that truth matters even when powerful people would prefer it remain hidden. The Chen family found a form of peace in knowing that Maya's death had not been in vain. Her investigation had ultimately succeeded in exposing the corruption she had discovered, even though she had not lived to see justice achieved. The families who had been intimidated and displaced received compensation and formal apologies from the city of Cedar Falls. The officials who had prioritized economic development over human dignity faced criminal charges and public accountability. But Susan Chen was most proud of the way Maya's story had inspired other young people to pursue journalism and social justice. Maya always believed that individual actions could make a difference. Susan told Jake during a final interview, she proved that even a 16-year-old with a notebook and determination could uncover truths that adults had chosen to ignore. Her story shows that democracy depends on people who are willing to ask difficult questions and refuse to accept easy answers. The abandoned grain elevator where Maya had died was purchased by the city and converted into a memorial park, with a statue honoring Maya and other journalists who had died pursuing the truth. The inscription on the memorial, taken from Maya's final social media post, captured the essence of her approach to journalism. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones happening right in front of us, in our own neighborhoods. We just don't know how to look for them yet. Jake's investigation had shown that Maya had learned how to look, and that her ability to see patterns of injustice had ultimately cost her everything. But it had also shown that her vision could inspire others to continue the work she had started, ensuring that her commitment to truth would outlive the brief life that had embodied it. As Jake concluded his final episode, he reflected on the circular nature of Maya's story. She had disappeared while investigating the treatment of displaced families, and her death had been covered up by the same kind of institutional power that had originally victimized those families. But her story had ultimately achieved the exposure and accountability she had been seeking, proving that truth has a persistence that can outlast those who would suppress it. Maya Chen was 16 years old when she died, Jake said in his closing remarks, but she understood something that many adults struggle to comprehend, that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit in that injustice. She refused to be silent, and her voice continues to speak through everyone who chooses to ask difficult questions and pursue uncomfortable truths. The podcast ended with audio from Maya's high school debate team, her voice captured on a recording from 2006 as she argued about the responsibility of citizens to hold their government accountable. Her words, preserved on aging equipment from Lincoln High School's Media Center, served as a final reminder of the principles that had guided her brief life and meaningful death. A democracy only works when people pay attention, Maya's 16-year-old voice declared, her passion for justice evident even through the static of decade-old recording equipment. And paying attention means asking questions, especially when the answers might be uncomfortable for people in power. Those words had guided Maya Chen through a brief but principled life. They had cost her everything, but they had also ensured that her story would continue to inspire others long after her voice had been silenced. In death, as in life, Maya Chen remained committed to the fundamental belief that truth matters, that justice is possible, and that ordinary people have both the power and the responsibility to hold their institutions accountable. If stories like Maya's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.